Hey guys, Uncle Steph here. So, this is a business lesson in negotiations. This is not a political video, so don't take it as such. So, I'm in Canada, and there is the US, the Trump administration, and Canada are negotiating. And I see leaders in my country, in Canada, making silly, unforced errors. So the most recent one is the premier, equivalent of governor of Ontario, this guy Ford. He's antagonizing Trump and the Trump administration while we are in the middle of negotiations trying to get a deal. There's no point to it. It's just bad tactics. Forget about the pros and cons if you hate Trump or you don't hate Trump. It's irrelevant to this discussion. The discussion is when you're trying to make a deal, and a very important deal, it's probably the most important deal Canada can make, you don't go out there busting balls. It's just stupid. It's just dumb, right? It's just bad business, bad negotiations. When you want to negotiate, when you're negotiating, especially if you have the weaker hand, especially if your counterparty, in this case, Canada versus U.S., U.S. has all the power. Like, Canada is a tiny, tiny economy relative to the U.S. Unfortunately, even our leaders have said it for years. They're starting to say it now, rather. Canada's economy is basically sell to the U.S. That's been our economy forever. And so we're extremely vulnerable to the U.S. gyrations, right? We're very vulnerable to the U.S. gyrations. As a former prime minister once said, Canada is a mouse sleeping with an elephant. If the elephant moves, we move. Or the other, the other thing that people would say about the relationship between Canada and U.S. If U.S. gets a cold, if U.S. gets a sniffle, we get a cold. Or if U.S., they get a mild cold, we get a bad flu. So we're highly dependent on the U.S. economy. So this guy Ford, the premier of Ontario, went out there and he put out a video. Basically, according to the Reagan Institute, Ronald Reagan is like the saint, one of the most respected presidents in history. I've seen both Democrats and Republicans praise him. According to the Reagan Institute, the people who manage Reagan's portfolio, if you will, they said that Doug Ford put out a commercial misrepresenting what Reagan was saying. And the misrepresentation was an attack at the Trump policy vis-a-vis tariffs. Again, this is not about what you think about tariffs, what you think about Trump, what you think about Canada, U.S. It's not about that. It's about a strategic analysis of what's going on. It was a huge mistake for the Premier of Ontario to attack Trump with a TV ad in the U.S., quoting Reagan, which is a high saint. It'd be like misquoting Jesus against Christians, or it would be like misquoting Muhammad against Muslims. It's just really a bad move. So if you quote Reagan, you better quote him accurately, especially if it's an attack on the Republicans, and especially if it's a direct attack on Trump policy. And we need Americans. Canadians have to grow up. You're a Canadian watching this. I've been in business for 36 years. We need the U.S. The U.S. does not really need us. We live in this illusory world that somehow we have as much influence on the U.S. and vice versa. It is not true. If trade between the U.S. and Canada were to be cut off, it would be a mild inconvenience for the U.S. for about 6 months. They would readjust. Only about 2% of their economy is directly related to Canadian trade, whereas us, it's like 35% of our economy. I saw a report in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago. They said that if the impasse, the trade tariffs things continues for like 6-7 months more, something like that, as much as 40% of Canadian small business would go bankrupt. Now, 40%. Now, you have to understand about 65, 70% somewhere in there of all jobs in Canada are driven by small business. So this is a disaster. Like, it would be road warrior adjacent economy and situation in Canada. So Doug Ford, I'm sorry, he's an idiot. You don't poke the bear. There's no point. You're not going to. Anyway, it was just a bad move. You got to go out there. You got to be courteous. You got to be forceful but courteous. But you can't pull any moves like misquoting Reagan, the high saint of republicanism. That's just bad. And Carney, the prime minister, this brand new prime minister, again, he does these weird moves where he says these things publicly that will not only piss off Trump, it's gonna piss off a lot of American politicians. Period. And I won't get into it, but he's done it 2 or 3 things, and I'm like, what are you doing, dude? Let's talk about this after the negotiations. Get the deal. They do things that need not have been done. It's not like it had to be done, and they just make it more and more difficult to get a deal. So I am a lifelong entrepreneur. Last time I had a job working for somebody, I was a bouncer in a nightclub. I was like 18 years old or 19. And at that point, I had started my business. I was only doing nightclub bouncing to pay my rent and so forth, so that I could get my business off the ground. Anyway, so I know business well. And like one of my mentors told me, he said, if we didn't have the U.S., he would be serving coffee in some coffee shop somewhere. It's such an important part of our economy. 90% of my business is in the U.S., 90%. Very little is in Canada, in fact. I make more money with the rest of the world than Canada, not including the U.S. They put in the U.S., or forget about it. Like, it's nothing. I make no sales in Canada. So it's like, if the Canadian politicians continue to try to play hardball, it's like a 5-year-old schoolgirl trying to play hardball against Mike Tyson. They're going to force me to leave. They're going to force me. So many companies are fleeing Canada. Huge amounts of money are fleeing Canada. And I'm looking at it. I'm not sitting down. I have to think about it, because if Trump decided to cut us off, that's it. I have to move. So, good thing I have U.S. relatives and so on. But anyway, that's another story. So there you go. What's the point of the video? Let me just wrap this up. I'm going to wrap it up by saying that when you're negotiation is about finding commonality, common interest, détente, trying to figure out how you can align our desires as people who are negotiating to come to an agreement. So the last thing you want to do is start stirring up crap that does not need to be stirred up. That's the last thing you want to do. It's like a scene in Sopranos where they're trying to negotiate a peace, and they got a peace between one mobster against the other mobster. And a third guy brings up something that piss off one of the mobsters, and they go to war. It's so stupid. So that's what we're doing. So anyway, when you go into negotiations, you want to try to go in there thinking about what is your counterparty has, the person you're negotiating with, what it is they want, what it is they need, how they feel about things, what you can do to sweeten the deal, to convince them to come to an agreement with you. Dale Carnegie, of a very famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence Others, something like that. Anyway, and he said that there's no way you can change somebody's mind, but what you can do is convince them that what you're proposing, I'm paraphrasing at best, what you're proposing to them is somehow aligned with what they want, right? So you're not doing that by misquoting one of the grand, Reagan. He's like one of the most important presidents in the Republican ecosystem. You're not going to come to an agreement very easily by misquoting him to attack the Republicans and Trump. It's just not smart. Don't be dumb like that. So when you're negotiating, go there, say, this is what I want. What does my opponent want? How can I convince them to how can I convince them to give me what I want? And satisfy their particular needs and wants as well. That is the key. But if you start insulting your counterparty's wife, start emailing his wife to tell him how much of a bastard he is, that's not going to win you points with him, right? And I make it an analogy, but you get the idea. I hope this is useful. Again, not political. This is a lesson in negotiation and business. Anyway, there you go. Cheers.